Welcome to our final reading of this semester at Rosemont College, part of the MFA program. Our first reader tonight is Molly Giordano. Molly is the Director of Development and External Affairs at the Delaware Art Museum in Wilmington. She has a master's in Public and Nonprofit Administration from the University of Pennsylvania and is working towards her MFA in Creative Writing at Rosemont College. She's been published in Crack the Spine and Dream Street's literary magazines and is currently on the second draft of a novel. When she's not working, you can find Molly playing with her 18-month-old daughter or lounging in front of the TV with her husband. Please welcome Molly Giordano.
This story is called The Incident. Part 1. The incident, as it came to be known throughout the school and town, occurred during our 7th grade end-of-year field trip to a shabby park on the outskirts of town. The park had a small pool surrounded by cracked concrete slabs and a chain-link fence, a basketball court and naked hoops, and a long row of wooden picnic tables. The morning started out like all our other end-of-year field trips at Cheat Lake Middle School. The girls, pale from a long West Virginia winter and short spring, boarded the bus in clumps and chatted about the day. They were insecure to reveal the two-piece bathing suits worn under jean capris and spaghetti-strap tank tops. The boys in their mesh basketball or cargo khakis sat in the back of the bus, speculating about which girl filled out her swimsuit best. Mr. Mayhew, Cheat Lake's 7th grade math teacher, sat in the back with the boys too, as he said to one of the teachers with an eye roll, "Keep the peace." When the boys began talking about girls' breasts, he admonished them loudly. But Jamie Sayers, who was sitting in front of the boys, reported she heard Mr. Mayhew whisper to the group that he thought Lauren Jackson, who began developing in 4th grade, had the most spectacular pair of tits in the county. Mr. Mayhew would later deny this comment, and the boys either couldn't or wouldn't remember when Principal Weathers asked for confirmation that afternoon. But Mr. Mayhew's comment about Lauren's breast wasn't really the point of the incident anyway. And besides, all of us knew that Jamie Sayers would do anything for attention. When the bus arrived at the park, we rushed in different directions. The girls headed to the pool to prance in their swimsuits, the boys to the basketball court, and the assorted awkward kids milled about the grassy area with books or frisbees. The first part of the morning was mostly uneventful. We had no broken bones or fights as there had been during past field trips. But something was off. Mrs. Lumpkin and Mrs. Hennessy both later said that despite the initial calm and unusual feeling colored the morning. They said we all seemed edgy, nervous. Mrs. Lumpkin attributed this aura, as she called it, to the cicadas. It was the spring of the once in every 17 years cicada infestation. The picnic coincided with the rare week that millions of glossy, red-eyed little beasts burrowed up from the earth to mate and lay eggs in the trees. Cicadas were everywhere in the park. They floated in the pool, shrieked overhead, and their discarded shells crunched underfoot like bubble wrap. The ground was also covered with small holes and matching pellets of earth where the bugs had burst forth from the surface several days earlier. When Mrs. Lumpkin spoke to Principal Weathers that afternoon, still shaky and teary-eyed, the cicadas were all she could talk about. The noise, she said quietly, dabbing her cheeks with a balled-up tissue, it just wouldn't stop, and every surface you looked at was moving with thousands of little red eyes. Part 2. Mr. Mayhew didn't mention the cicadas during his meeting either. He didn't say much of anything, really. He just sat in Principal Weathers' office, sweaty and disheveled, only half hearing what Principal Weathers was saying. "Why, don't understand. The student's father. Leave of absence." Mr. Mayhew watched Principal Weathers' mouth form tight O's and triangles. He tried ordering the shapes in his mind to make sounds, but he couldn't. All he could hear was the buzzing, the ceaseless buzzing. Josh Mayhew, or Mr. M as he was known to some of his students, was one of the school's only male teachers. He was also at least a decade younger than his tired-looking 40-something colleagues, who always seemed bogged down with their own children, their bills, their boring daily struggles. Mr. Mayhew was single and knew enough at teaching that he still thought he could make math fun with his funny ties and endless jokes. Every Friday, he brought treats for the class and played math-related card games. The talk always turned to weekend plans, and sometimes the boys would beg him to join them at the Friday night football games. Mr. Mayhew always declined with a wave of his hand, saying he had better things to do than hang out with kids. But in reality, he didn't. He was single in a small rural town 4 states from his family. When he first moved to Cheat Lake 3 years earlier to take the position, he tried in earnest to date, but most of the women his age were already married, and he didn't find the leftovers very appealing. So Mr. Mayhew went to the football games alone and sat with the teachers and their disinterested husbands. Sometimes he looked down at the bleachers at the boys clustered along the chain-link fence, shoving each other in jest, and occasionally slipping behind the snack shed to sip beer from somebody's basement fridge. On Mondays before class, he would walk over to the boys, hands on hips, and ask, "Now boys, tell me what was so interesting behind the snack shed at that football game." The boys would snicker, he would pretend to be stern, and then all would laugh. Alex Messner was the ringleader of the 7th graders. He was medium height and lean with olive green skin, green slanted eyes, and a mature voice. He was the kind of boy who dated 8th grade girls and went to high school parties. He was always the first to laugh when Mr. Mayhew made a joke, signaling to the class it was okay to join in. The other teachers also liked Alex, but not for the reasons Mr. Mayhew did. They felt sorry for Alex because his mother had died of a blood clot 1 year earlier. She was in the kitchen one afternoon making a chicken pot pie when she collapsed. And it was he who found her on the floor when he got home from school 3 hours later. Her hands were cold and still covered with flour. The school bus was scheduled to leave for the park at 8 a.m. Instead of going to his classroom to get settled for the day, Mr. Mayhew waited in front of the school holding his red Velcro lunch bag. Mrs. Lumpkin and Mrs. Hennessy stood on either side of him, crossed arms. "Another last day of school," sighed Mrs. Lumpkin. God, that class was a handful. "Really?" said Mr. Mayhew. "I think the kids were pretty good this year." Mrs. Lumpkin snorted. "You haven't been doing this long enough to see it, I suppose." "See what?" "How difficult this age is, the social cliques, the emotional crap, the issues at home. It's like when they turn 13, these kids wake up and everything hits them at once. 6th graders are still oblivious. 8th graders are hardening into little cynics, but 7th graders, they don't know which way's up." Mr. Mayhew said nothing. He felt sorry for Mrs. Lumpkin. She was the cynic. She never took the time to get to know the students the way he did. "Hey, Mr. M, you sitting with us on the bus today?" Alex was standing on the other end of the parking lot, thumbs hooked into the pocket of his cargo shorts. He had a way of leaning back and tilting his chin up when he spoke. It made him look older, almost eye level with Mr. Mayhew. "Of course, Alex, someone's got to keep an eye on you troublemakers." Mr. Mayhew turned to Mrs. Lumpkin and rolled his eyes. "Don't worry, I'll sit with him to keep the peace." "Bless you, Josh." Mr. Mayhew thought the bus ride went well. The students behaved, even the boys. He only had to scold them once when they were giggling about Lauren's breasts. He would have let it go because, well, boys will be boys, but Brad Shortman's comment was loud enough for Mrs. Hennessy to hear. So what choice did he have? When they pulled into the parking lot, Alex asked Mr. Mayhew to play basketball with him. "Come on, Mr. M, show us what you're made of. I bet you could really kick ass on the court." Mr. Mayhew noticed that Mrs. Lumpkin was standing behind them. "Language," he said to Alex in a firm tone. "Sorry, Mr. M, I didn't mean to say ass," Alex said, the corners of his mouth turned up. Alex and Brad selected each other as team captains before the group arrived at the dilapidated court. The other boys lined up at the edge of the asphalt without being asked. Mr. Mayhew stood at the end of the line, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders thrust back. Alex selected Mr. Mayhew and three other boys to join the team. Mr. Mayhew watched the remaining boys slink off to the splintered wooden bleachers. "Alex, now make sure to switch the players at the next game so everyone has a chance to play," he said. "Sure thing, Mr. M," Alex said as he dribbled the ball back and forth between his legs. "You want to do tip-off? You're the tallest." Mr. M walked to the faded white line and leaned in, ready to jump. His heart was racing. His palms felt itchy. Mr. Mayhew was a head taller than Brad, so he easily tipped the ball toward Alex, who dribbled down the court and made a graceful layup. The ball dropped through the netless hoop and rolled into a muddy puddle. Alex picked it up and kept dribbling. Each time the ball hit the asphalt, flecks of mud splattered on his hairless legs. "Great tip-off! You do kick ass, Mr. M," Alex shouted as he pumped his fist in the air. Mr. Mayhew smiled and looked over his shoulder to make sure the other teachers weren't within earshot. Mr. Mayhew played well for the next 10 minutes. He missed only one shot. He missed the only shot he tried, but he stole the ball 3 more times and made 2 more assists to Alex. But after that, the game started to move too quickly. Mr. Mayhew's khaki pants rubbed between his inner thighs, and his face got so hot, he felt like his eyes were filling with boiling water. The students were moving so fast that by the time he made it to one side of the court, his agile teammates were already returning to the other end. As Mr. Mayhew ran back and forth, uselessly swatting at the boy in the opposing team he was supposed to guard, Alex shouted encouragement over his shoulder. "Come on, Mr. M, keep up." Halfway into the game, Mr. Mayhew tried to call timeout. "Time," he shouted, making a T symbol with his hands. Alex stopped dribbling and held the ball over his head. The other boys orbited around, trying to grab it. "Let's go, old man," he yelled. Mr. Mayhew shook his head and leaned between his knees. He exhaled hard and licked his lips. The thump-thump of his heart in his ears and the siren of cicadas overhead was deafening. He felt dizzy and disoriented, but he didn't want to quit in front of his students. So he righted himself and returned to the asphalt, which seemed hot enough to melt his off-brand sneakers. "Think fast, Mr. M," shouted Alex as he hurled a hard pass at Mr. Mayhew. Mr. Mayhew turned just in time for the muddy ball to hit him square in the chest. He made an oomph sound and fell backward. For a moment, Mr. Mayhew lay still on the ground. He listened to his heart pounding in his throat and held onto his chest, for the ball had left a crescent-shaped stain on his white polo shirt. In the dim distance, he could hear Alex and a few of the other boys laughing. "Nice catch, Mr. M," Alex said, and then quieter. "What a loser." Then the sound of the boys and the cicadas and the smell of toasted asphalt disintegrated. For several seconds, all was quiet, but soon a vaguely familiar feeling overtook Mr. Mayhew, something he hadn't felt in a long time, since college maybe or high school. It felt like soda fizz. It started in his chest and rapidly expanded outward, down his veins and toward his fingertips, which clenched into fists. And then it happened. Mr. Mayhew sprung to his feet and lunged at Alex. "You little shit," he screamed, flinging him to the ground and crouching over him. Everything around Mr. Mayhew melted into a blur. He couldn't hear anything. Even his own mouth had no sound. Mr. Mayhew felt words forming on his tongue and lips, but once in the air they disappeared. But he could still hear the cicadas. They were muted like the whine of a distant boat engine, but they were still there, always there. It wasn't until later, when Principal Weathers, flanked by 2 stoic police officers, was interviewing him, that Mr. Mayhew learned what he'd said to Alex. As he crouched over the boy, watching blood drip over his lips and chin, multiple witnesses reported that Mr. Mayhew screamed, "Go home and cry to your mommy, why don't you? Oh, that's right. You don't have one anymore, because she's dead, and now you'll always be alone."